Well, welcome everybody. Thank you first and foremost to Dr. Markey for allowing us to have this talk and basing it in your class, but everyone else that's come too, thank you so much. It's really a great honor to have here Dr. Bruce Jentleson, who's going to be giving, as you know, the lecture today on the talk on his most recent book. I'm not going to spend a long time on this bio. It's a very long bio. You can read it along, but a couple of things that I think are extremely relevant for this book in particular that you should know about is that as Dr. Jentleson's played a very influential role for a lot of us here at the Med School and many others in our profession of being able to bridge this gap between policy and academia. We're trained as academics, but how does it relate to the real world, so to speak, in policy? This book does that, and it draws on a very rich career so far, and I'll say so far because there's still a lot left, of really doing that, both in the academic field and also through the service in government, through a number of both working at the State Department of Policy Planning, advising presidential candidate Al Gore, as well as throughout parts of his career, and many other capacities, both in and out of government, informally and formally, most recently with the Obama administration. So anyway, without much further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Jentleson to talk more about this, and I want to encourage you after he finishes talking for 30 to 40 minutes to ask questions, play questions about the book, and I'm sure anything else he's willing to entertain that way. But thank you very much, thanks for your attendance, and thank you, Dr. Jentleson, for coming. And here's the book, in case I'm going to pitch it here. This is a beautiful book. He even has there's a copy here, and it's on Audible from what I understand too. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Professor Rubin for the invitation, as well as many colleagues I have here at the Sandon School and at Georgia Tech. And I'll tell you students, and they didn't pay me to say this, it's really the truth, we've really got some amazing faculty here. And I've worked with them in a variety of capacities, and I encourage you to take full advantage of their knowledge, their mentorship, and a whole lot of other things while you're here, be you graduate students or undergrads. And I very much want to give the talk and watch the time, so we do have some time for questions and answers and the like, and just some general discussion. But as Larry said, the title of the book is The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th Century Statesmanship. And I want to make 3 points at the outset. One is, the book is kind of a 2 cheers for diplomacy. Not 3, but 2. And the reason for both aspects of that is, one is I feel like, particularly in an era in which we've had the 2 longest wars in American history, the role of diplomats has kind of gotten overshadowed. I bet you if I went around the room, people could name a lot of well-known generals, and rightly so, many of them deserve that, but probably not as many major diplomats. And I think that it's important to think about and realize the role that diplomacy, broadly defined, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by diplomacy and statesmanship in a second, gets that. So 2 cheers, but not 3. 3 because, and again, I've had the opportunity to serve twice in the State Department in the early years of the Bill Clinton administration, and then under President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, as well as a variety of other roles that have had me involved directly in American policy. And sometimes I think diplomacy and statesmanship is too much about process and not strategy. Let's kind of just keep talking. We don't really know where it's going to go, but talking is better than not, and there's some truth to that. But my sort of tough love push to the statesmanship and diplomacy world has been to think about strategy. And each of these cases that I deal with in this book, there was a strategy that was essential in order to get to the breakthroughs that were made. The second point I want to make, in addition to the 2 cheers, is that this is not a Trump reactive or a Trump-centric book. I actually was working on it before the Trump administration. And let me just read you an excerpt from the preface. And so one of the questions I was really thinking about was, what can we learn from 20th century statesmanship for the 21st century? For a while in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it seemed like the world was going in a positive direction. The Cold War was ending peacefully, dictatorships were falling to democracy, globalization appeared to be spreading the wealth. History was said to be over, with world affairs so harmonious as to be downright boring. And yet the end of the Cold War has not meant the end of war. US relations with both Russia and China have grown tense and tenuous. That democratic wave has broken up on some rocky shores. Globalization has had losers as well as winners. History has come roaring back, its ancient hatreds fueled by modern venom. Climate change is speeding up, global health pandemics are spreading. Cyber and other emerging technologies are in need of rules of the game, but aren't getting them. Indeed, it's a lot easier to name a global problem that's been growing worse than one in which progress is being made. This was my thinking even before Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. All along, I've intended this book to draw lessons from 20th century statesmanship to help shape and motivate the peace and security breakthroughs our 21st century so crucially needs. Trump, as I come back to the epilogue, has made this all the more urgent. Others, such as Vladimir Putin, do as well. So I talk in the book about lessons, but it's very much something that is not just talking about what's happened in the last couple of years. And the third point is I actually wrote this for a very broad audience. If you decide to read it, the best feedback I've gotten from people is they found it a good read. It's interesting, they learned something. When we academics write, sometimes for just other academics, shall we say, it's stuff you read because you have to, not necessarily because you want to, or if you're having trouble sleeping, right? And a lot of things written for policy. People can tell you, I never talk about the policy world as the real world compared to the academic world, because it ain't so real either. But a lot of policy work we do is in a particular jargon and stuff, and I really felt that this was a book I wanted to write for broad audience. So I've given talks in bookstores, on C-SPAN, as well as to university-based and other audiences. So let me set up the frame and the approach that gives you a general sense of what the book's about, and then take a couple of the case studies I have and use those as examples, and then we can go to any that you might like that I don't talk directly about in the question and discussion period. So leadership lessons. I have an epigram here from Isaiah Berlin, and it's, as many know, it's always a good idea to start with something from Isaiah Berlin. He was a very wise man. But it's one of the points. He says, at crucial moments and at turning points, individuals in their decisions and acts can determine the course of history. So this is the classic debate. Do leaders make history, or does history make leaders? And one of the ideas I got for this book was actually from an article by some colleagues who wrote about what you might call bad guy leaders. And for example, they looked at Hitler and they said there was no question that Germany was going to be unstable after World War I. But the particular form that instability took had an awful lot to do with the leader that emerged. It wasn't a given, and another leader might have even led Germany into war, but not necessarily the same way. They made the same argument for Napoleon in the French Revolution. And I started to think that and flip that about leaders at crucial moments, like Isaiah Berlin says, but on the more positive side. When you go to graduate school of political science and international relations, it's beat out of you, the individual level of analysis, right? We don't do that. It's all about systems and structures and balance of power. And there's a lot of truth to that. But part of my thinking and argument was that at crucial moments, the leader makes a difference. That's sort of the canon in scholarly community. Inside the Beltway, it's like all about leaders. These two had chemistry, they didn't, sort of People magazine version of diplomacy. And I felt like there's a middle ground there that can be useful analytically. And I approach this in two respects in the book. One is a little bit social science-y, what I call the 3 C's: constraints, conducive conditions, and choices. That any leader, and by the way, I actually joined some work from the business community, from other sectors of society, for leaders that have also tried to make major breakthroughs. Any leader may face constraints, and those constraints may be so substantial that no magic individual could make major change. And oftentimes leaders have conducive conditions that facilitate the change that they are seeking to make. But the crucial dimension are the choices they make. That even if there are conducive conditions, a leader has to make a set of choices and be able to pursue them. I also approach this as what I call statesmanship moneyball, right? So if any of you do fantasy baseball or whatever, and my kids will tell you that So I was actually, in 2012, I took a group of Duke alumni to Cuba when we had slightly opened relations and not totally normalized them. And had some meetings where people told me, I can't come to your hotel, but maybe it's such and such a fountain and we can have a conversation, which was kind of interesting from a foreign policy perspective. But I also ended up with a long story of finding these guys who were down there at the same time who had a softball team that were they scheduled all these games against a bunch of Cubans. So I ended up playing for like a day and a half and playing softball against Cubans. And so, as my son said to me at the time, Dad, this is like your heaven, foreign policy and baseball in the same place. So in Moneyball, in sports, they'll look at a statistic like wins against replacement player, WAR. How many wins does the shortstop contribute to their team that another shortstop would have not? There's a fancy statistical formula. And I sort of turned this into SARL, statesman against replacement leader. Would another leader in this situation made the same choices? I played with a couple of statistical calculations, but they weren't really working, so I just make the argument on the basis of analysis and the evidence I can provide for that. And every leader I have in here passes the Receives test and the Statesmanship Moneyball test. So once one decides to study leadership, how do you study it? James McGregor Burns, who was really the leading political scientist historian on this, called it one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on Earth. Walter Isaacson, who's been a biographer of Henry Kissinger, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci. After all of that, he calls it, quote, an elusive quality. An Amazon search turned up 191,637 books with the top term leadership in their title. And the corporate world over the last 2 decades has spent $14 billion on leadership development, yet 75% of study respondents deem the programs ineffective. And so there's both this fascination with leadership, it really matters, and this frustration with how we can get a handle on it to understand how it works and draw lessons. And again, in trying to think about this, the framework I use draws on leadership from a lot of different areas, and I call it the who, why, how, what framework. Who are these leaders as individuals? Not personality determinism, but what I talk about in the book is personal capital. What is the personal capital, in some cases a moral capital, like say Nelson Mandela, who's in the book, that they bring to their positions that's not just a function of the positions they occupy. That proves to be a really important quality at the who level. Why? Why did they make the crucial choices they did? A lot of interesting work is being done on narratives, especially in the video, social media age. And one of the things you see in this is that there are 3 elements to the narrative that leaders who are trying to make change bring to their work, the so-called vision. One is sort of an analytic dimension, what's wrong with the present. The second is a prescriptive dimension, where do I want to take you? What's my proposal for this big change I'm asking you to do? And the third dimension is a normative dimension, which is understanding, which leaders often don't do, as I explain some of the limits of the cases that I deal with. That change is a frightening thing. Big change is a frightening thing, and so culturally and otherwise, you have to make people reasonably comfortable with the change without totally diluting what you want to do. So you have to have a normative dimension, ways in which it's not totally inconsistent with some core values the society or culture has, or things that they have grown up with, and that's sort of the why. The how is, how do they pursue their goals? What 2 theorists of leadership at Harvard call orchestrating the transformation. You could have the personal capital, and you could have this vision that does all those 3 things. But if you don't have a good strategy, it's going to blow up in your face. And they talk about things like, they have an expression called controlling the temperature. How do you, when you're making big change, how do you control the temperature that's there in the political dynamics of the arena you're working in? Or keeping the opposition close. For example, I have Mikhail Gorbachev in the book, In the End of the Cold War, and one of his ultimate failures was not keeping the opposition close. The American ambassador, Jack Matlock at the time, was also one of our alum at Duke, and has come back in his retirement, has shared his oral interviews with us in his papers, talks about how we had intelligence about what the with the coup that was being planned, and went to Gorbachev in July and August 1991. And he'd gotten to the point where, even though he had these amazing skills that had brought him to the point, he'd kind of gotten a little bit, if you will, arrogant, and hadn't kept the opposition close, and didn't really think that intelligence was worth acting upon, and thus the results. But the how is extremely important. So it's not just the vision thing. And the what is what was and wasn't achieved. A quote from Machiavelli: "There is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, than to initiate a new order of things." If this was a book about perfect peace, it'd be like really thin. I would have finished it a long time ago. But I make an argument here, and I'll talk about that more in a second, about breakthroughs. And I try to draw lessons of the book from both what was and what wasn't achieved. So that's the leadership part. The statesmanship part, yes, there were presidents and prime ministers and secretary of states and foreign ministers in here and other national leaders. I also have some leaders from international institutions like the United Nations, one of the cases I'll talk about in a little more detail. And I also have leaders from NGOs and social movements who did for peace what governments were unable or unwilling to do. And so I'm using statesmanship not in the sense of being affiliated with a state in your official position. Particularly in the 21st century world, where we have a lot of literature and studies about the role of NGOs out there in the world and others, of acknowledging that in the 20th century and in the 21st century, there have been some big breakthroughs in which the lead role was really played by non-state actors, either because governments were unwilling for other interests or reasons, or unable to do what the NGOs did. The Peacemakers I just talked about, it's really those who made major breakthroughs in various aspects of global peace, significant progress on issues long thought intractable, beyond the step-by-step of the usual transactional diplomacy, more transformational. But again, not perfect peace. And there have been breakthroughs often have backsliding and backlashes. So for example, I mentioned Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, and we can talk about this. I am not of the school that this is a new Cold War between us and Russia. It's not nearly as ideological, it's not nearly as global, and we're not on the brink of nuclear war, like some of us who had to hide under desks in elementary school during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember all too well. There are issues here, but at least my argument has been that the breakthroughs that were achieved have not gone away. There's a whole lot of chipping away at them over time, but it doesn't take away from learning what was achieved. So who then are the profiles? One of the fun things about giving talks on this book of variety of audiences, people say, well, why didn't you include so-and-so or such and such, and I welcome your thoughts, or why did you include so-and-so? I can't believe you did that. So a couple of caveats, and then I'll run through the whole list and then dive into a couple of them. It's a representative sample, not definitive. I talk about global peace in 5 dimensions, which roughly corresponds, I think, to the way we think about it in policy and in an intellectual, scholarly way. Major power relations, which has been the source of war and non-war more often than anything else throughout history. Building international institutions is a second area. A third area is reconciling the politics of identity, the politics of who I am and who you are, and why that's a reason for me to kill you before you or members of your group kill me, as a third area. Fourth is advancing freedom and human rights. And fifth is promoting global sustainability. Probably not an area that I would have had in a book, or maybe would have had 50 years ago. But that gets into global environment and global pandemics and global health. So it's a representative. I chose cases within each of those to make points about what it takes in those particular areas of building peace that are characteristic of the statesmanship. There were others, they may come up, that I actually really wanted to have in the book, but so the rule basically in the trade side of publishing is you're not going to get a lot of invitations to bookstores or other sorts of things if the price is over $30, unlike Cambridge Press, right, with the publishing. So we came in at $28.95, and there were a couple chapters that I had to cut. They said, if you just want to go back to one of your university presses, but I really wanted this to reach a broad audience. So we'll see if you ask me about those. If not, I'm happy to tell you what they were. That's one. Secondly, is it's a particular peacemaking role, not their overall roles, foreign policy or otherwise. I'm really of the view that that we can learn from people whose policies we otherwise disagree with, from areas in which we might agree or we might think that they were successful rather than not. And that'll come particularly true in two of the cases I'll mention. And third, they were not perfect people. Right? Nelson Mandela, for all of our admiration of him, had terrible relations with most of his children, and was not faithful to his wives, but we still think wonderfully of him. Gandhi, who's also in the book, had some very odd ways of testing his asceticism in terms of interactions with young women and the like. And I don't want to get into like a BuzzFeed version of the book here, but the point is, you don't need to be a perfect person to be an effective statesman. So let me go tell you who's in the book, and I chose a couple that I think make points, but I'm happy to talk about others when we go through. So I have two cases in the managing major power rivalries part. And I should say, by the way, one thing I left out is lessons from 20th century statesmanship. So at the end of each of these 5 sections, I draw out lessons for the issues that we face today. And the publisher kind of has it, you can't see it from here, but like there's a gray pages where you get to those lessons. I just wrote an article last week that some of you, I think, saw in War on the Rocks, one of the more prominent blog sites in international affairs, called the Trump-Kim Summit and 3 Ps of high-level summitry, which draws on lessons in this book for that as an example of what you can learn. But in terms of the cases themselves, the 2 20th century cases I have are Henry Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, the US-China opening, 1971-72. Get 2 points about that. I don't think that the tensions in US-China relations in any way mean that the opening was not a very substantial breakthrough. And 2, suffice to say, if you've read other things I've written, I'm not a fan of many aspects of Kissinger's foreign policy, from Chile to Vietnam, etc. But I do believe this was Kissinger and statesmanship in ways that are important to learn from. And then a chapter on Gorbachev, and to a certain extent Reagan. But Gorbachev's the one that I argue really passes that statesmanship Moneyball test the most, where another Soviet leader would not have made the same choices. And scholars debate this all the time. That's my point of view. And I think my view of Reagan gives him more credit than many sort of liberal scholars do, and maybe less than some more conservative scholars and others do. And then I draw out implications for major power relations in the 21st century. Building international institutions, there's a chapter on Woodrow Wilson and FDR. And I will confess, some of you have used my textbook, and when I first wrote that textbook, first version, my version of the failure of the League of Nations was poor Woodrow Wilson, this visionary, hailed in Europe. He comes back, and he has this vision, and he runs into this stubborn isolationist Senate in America that doesn't want to do it. Well, when you actually start to dig into the research on Wilson, you see that on a list of arrogant people, he's pretty high up, and that there were deals to be had there, not necessarily with Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, but with Republicans in the Senate that could have passed his League of Nations, the Versailles Treaty, with some compromises, but not the ones that would fundamentally undermine it. But he was, as Clemenceau said, French Prime Minister who met with Wilson at Versailles, he said, God only had 10 commandments. Wilson has 14 points. He was very arrogant, and he wouldn't accept these deals, and his health factors in. So it wasn't a simple tale of American politics going isolationist. It really had to do with leadership and your willingness to do that how part. And then I do a bit on FDR, really just related to the United Nations, and ways in which he was setting up the planning while the war was going on. As early as 1942, when this country was still, very shaken by the attack on Pearl Harbor, beginning to mobilize for our first military efforts, actually in Northern Africa in late 1942. Yet he saw that one of the mistakes before was you needed to plan for the post-war world before the war was over. And I talk a little bit about that. But the main chapter in that part is on Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations in the 1950s. And I'll come back to his because it's one that I think is really important to highlight. The third section on reconciling politics and identity has Nelson Mandela, who I call the iconic statesman of reconciliation, Yitzhak Rabin, soldier as peacemaker and the things that Rabin achieved, and again, hotly debated. In my view, both Israel and the Palestinians and the region would have been a lot better off if things had continued in that direction. And then the story of two women named Mayreed Corrigan and Betty Williams, who in Northern Ireland, back in the period of what was called the Troubles, when the death toll had gone up the highest from 1969 to 1976, led this women called Northern Ireland Women for Peace. They were everyday people. Mayreed Corrigan was a secretary in a Guinness brewery. And she had an incident where her sister and her sister's children were killed in a military clash in Belfast. Some of them were killed, others in the hospital, and she's in the hospital visiting her sister, and she leaves, and a reporter from BBC says, "Tell me what you're thinking," and she makes a statement about the violence, and nobody really wants this except a small segment of people. And this is 1976, and as we say today, it went viral. It went viral. There was no social media, but it fundamentally transformed the conflict. The killing never went up to that level. The peace agreement took another 20-ish years, and it was achieved by diplomats, Irish diplomats, Senator George Mitchell. But I try to make a point with them about ways in which breakthroughs can really start that statesmen and capitalism. The freedom and protecting human rights section, I sort of say that in the 20th century there were 4 major types of issues of freedom and human rights. One was anti-colonialism, and I do use Gandhi there. Second was ending Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and I use Lech Walesa. The human rights movement, and there, if I have time, I'll come back to this one, or we can talk more, is the story of an obscure British lawyer who launched in 1961 Amnesty International. Same thing, he wrote an op-ed in a paper called The Observer on May 28, 1961. And those of us who write op-eds are always trying to have impact. And again, it went viral. There was no social media, all these newspapers, and it was about human rights, and really kicked off the contemporary human rights movement in ways that Amnesty International is not the be-all and the end-all, but it really seeded the ground, SEEDED, that others have built upon and made human rights NGOs more significant. And the fourth one, which is really not about Soviet domination, but is about ending military governments, is probably the most controversial one, and that's Aung San Suu Kyi, which I call a cautionary tale. And I'd started working on her well before the whole Rohingya genocide, in which she has at minimum been complicit over the last 2+ years. And I was trying to tell the story of the role she played in helping, not totally bring down, but bring a degree of democracy back to Burma, Myanmar. And in the summer of 2017, when we were finishing up the book for the publisher, I called my editor and I said, I got to pull her from the book. This is pretty awful, the role she's playing. And again, some of it's complicit, not doing it herself, but it still matters as the most powerful person in the government. And he said, let's talk about this. He said, every one of the stories in your book is about the scope and limits of leadership. Lech Walesa led the downfall of communism in Poland, yet he was a terrible president. Gandhi, had he lived, nobody would have ever thought he would have been a very good prime minister, but he led the movement. Peter Benenson, the lawyer who launched Amnesty International, had actually run for the House of Commons 3 times and lost. And he said, we shouldn't lose the lessons of the role she played because of what she's done. And so we went back and did some revisions to say the more things go on, the more uncomfortable I get to a certain extent with that, but I still think they're important, and to learn from both. And we framed the chapter very much in that way, consistent with what we think our message is. And other people say, how can you even have in your book about peacemakers? It's a fair point of view, but this at least is the point of view that led us to the book. So let me just flesh out a couple of these, and then come to some concluding remarks, and then open it up. So let's do Kissinger and Zhou Enlai. I had the opportunity to interview Kissinger for the book. I'll tell you a funny story that's on the side. I'd met him a couple times, but in groups. And in 2001 or 2, I was invited to go with the congressional delegation to this big conference, security conference that happens in Germany, in Munich. And we were flying out of what was then called Andrews Air Force Base. Senator McCain and a couple other senators were in the delegation, and there were a bunch of congressmen. And it came after the 2000 campaign, where I had been Senator Lieberman was involved, and I'd been a major foreign policy advisor to Al Gore in his campaign, and so they invited some of us wonky types to go. And it's flying out of Andrews Air Force Base, and I said to my wife, I said, well, normally when I travel overseas at night, I just put my running suit on. She said, you can't do that. You're traveling with and Henry Kissinger's on the plane, You have to dress like this. I said, to sleep in? He said, do it. So I get to the plane, I'm boarding the plane, I'm dressed like this, and there's Kissinger, on the landing, shaking over his hand in his running suit, right? Of course, they had compartments, and we landed in Munich. He was, showered and fully dressed, and I went home and I said to my wife, I said, well, Kissinger was wearing a running suit. She said, yeah, he's Henry Kissinger, you're Bruce Jentleson, you got. But I did get to interview him for the book, which was fascinating. And when you do these interviews, like a lot of my colleagues know, I didn't really want to know every detail of his talks with Joe Enlai in 1972. That's not fair. And I had read most of the transcripts. They'd been declassified and I'd done a lot of other research. And I wanted to know the color. And the first question I asked him was, there was this reference in the transcripts at your very first meeting where you walk in and the first thing you do is put out your hand to shake Joe Enlai's hand. And he said, and he's not known for giving credit to others. He gave credit to some of the China specialists that were on his staff, a guy named Dick Solomon, who had been a professor at the University of Michigan, and Winston Lord. So in 1955, at the Geneva Conference, after the French fell in Dien Bien Phu and dividing up Southeast Asia, it was attended by John Foster Dulles, our Secretary of State, super Cold Warrior, the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, he of the cocktail, and Joe Enlai. And Dulles shook hands with Molotov, but not Joe Enlai. And to understand that, you have to go back to the context that some of us grew up with of Red China. Soviets were the ones that had the nuclear weapons, but China was the one that we had the most demonic views of. Some of that, I think, was racism. And so that was sort of Dulles' sense. And so when Kissinger shook hands with Joe Enlai, it was a show of respect and trust. And over the course of their meetings, which were phenomenal, when you think about the way all presidents do summits today, not just Trump, but Obama, Bush, they met on their first trip, 17 hours of meetings, only some with aides, some one-on-one, with, by the way, each had their own translator. Little aside there. And then in their October meeting, which was 4 days, 10 meetings, 23 hours and 40 minutes. We have summits today, you walk in with your talking points, and when you're trying to change a relationship, you really need to build this personal dimension of trust and respect and understanding. And Kissinger said that over the course of the meetings, when they got to know each other, Joe Enlai said to him, he actually wrote this in a memo to Nixon. He said, I only saw Joe Enlai get angry 2 times. One was recounting to me the story about Dulles, 16 years earlier, and telling the story and how much it meant to him. The other was some other incident. So at the end of the day, Nixon and Mao signed all the deals. As they say, they got the opera. But the statesmanship that was extraordinary. We sometimes look back at historical successes and we say, well, of course that happened. But if you had gone to Las Vegas in June '71 and said, give me odds that the US and China are going to make a breakthrough, you could have gotten really good odds. And it took this statesmanship that they did. And one of the lessons, and I write about this in the Rocks piece, looking at the next summit, it's a very interesting one because it's the opposite of much diplomatic thinking. They made the transactional serve the transformational. Again, I've written a lot of memos when I've been in government. Here's the things, Mr. Secretary, Madam Secretary, you need to accomplish in your meetings. These are your takeaways. These are your deliverables. And there's obviously some value to that, whether it's with allies or adversaries. But there's a quote from Joe Enlai in the transcripts in which he says, only the settlement of fundamental questions first can lead to the settlement of other questions. And what he's arguing there is that you have to start to transform the overall strategic relationship in ways that make compromise more doable. So we wanted them to basically sit on the North Vietnamese, and they didn't do that, but they stopped some forms of aid, and they wanted us to fully sever relations with Taiwan, and we didn't do that. And so both sides were willing to compromise on their number one transactional issue, still get something that was important to them. partly because they began to see a vision, and some of it was in the context of each wanting to play off the Soviet Union. They began to see a vision of the possibilities for the relationship. Really important concept that runs against the grain, and again, it's an argument I make about the US-North Korean relationship. One could apply this to US-Iran. It very much fits the Cold War. It's what Reagan and Gorbachev did. To the concern of many of Reagan's sort of much more right-wing aides, like Richard Pearl, that the old man had gone soft. But he understood that, and that led to a lot of the agreements they made. So the conclusions that come out of this are, forgive my interest or cutesiness with alliteration, but I had the 3 C's. These are the 3 P's: the personal, the policy, and the political. But the way breakthroughs happen, you need all 3 elements. You need to build a personal relationship among principals. Not so that they're best buddies, but that you get this respect and trust that allow for compromises to be made and a degree of confidence that you will continue in this direction. Reagan and Gorbachev had that. Kissinger-Zhou and Enlai had that. Nixon and Mao sort of had that, but they only really met once. That's the personal. The policy is what I've been talking about. You know, finding that common ground, you know, with the beginnings of the transformational. I mean, it was another 7 years before we gave full diplomatic recognition to China. We're still working on the relationship. But you have to have the policy elements where there's enough common ground. So for example, one of the points I make about the Singapore summit was, you know, we said there were going to be complete denuclearization. And yet our notion of that was, yeah, as soon as you're done, you get the economic benefits then. And most real experts say it would take at least 10 to 15 years minimum to do this. And the North Koreans was, no, if we do X, we get this, and we do that, and we do that. And both sides didn't trust each other. So you have to have a policy element. And then you have to have a political. You got to manage the domestic politics. This is where Nixon and Mao came in. Zhou Enlai called Mao 2-3 times a day. And every once in a while he'd walk into a meeting the next morning and he'd backtrack on something Kissinger said. And Kissinger knew it was because Mao didn't like it. But so you have to manage the political. Zhou Enlai was not capable of that on his own. Kissinger was not. This is our proverbial Nixon goes to China. This to a certain extent fit to Yitzhak Rabin that Shimon Peres didn't have. And so you really need all 3 elements. And I make the same kind of analysis as a framework for the end of the Cold War. And I think in this article, I'm not optimistic that these can be achieved, the personal, the policy, and the political. But this is what it would really take to start a breakthrough in that relationship. And again, we can come back to this. Let me tell you about one more at least, and that's Dag Hammarskjöld, right? If I did a Rorschach ink blot test about, I do this in my own class, tell me one word that describes the UN. Most of the attitudes I get are not particularly complimentary out of the UN. So Hammarskjöld was the 2nd Secretary General of the UN. The title of the chapter is what's called the Secular Pope, which was actually a quote from someone about Hammarskjöld. When he was appointed in April 1993, he was greeted by his predecessor, who called the position, quote, the most impossible job in the world. He had had many distinguished accomplishments as a Swedish diplomat. He was 48 years old at the time, but many people in Washington dismissed him as just your average bureaucrat. So I use a couple of cases to make the point about his statesmanship. One is, right after he came into office in 1954-55, there were a number of prisoners of war in China and in Korea from the Korean War. And there were 2 American prisoners in China that they were about to put on trial as spies, you know, in violation of the Geneva Conventions and everything. And it could have caused a real crisis, including with people like John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State. Hammarskjöld intervened in the issues and began to try to work the diplomacy. Now, mind you, Red China is not even a member of the UN then, right? Taiwan still has the seat. And he kind of goes back and forth. The very first trip ever made by a Secretary General to a national capital to negotiate was he went to Beijing. And he had discussions, in fact, with Zhou Enlai. And they had constructive talks, but they weren't resolved. And let me just pick this up quickly in the book. After this had been going on for a few months. In July of 1955, Hammarskjöld set off for a vacation with friends on the Swedish coast to celebrate his 50th birthday. He gets a message from the Chinese embassy in Stockholm wishing him a happy birthday and asking what gift he might like to receive. Release of the American prisoners, he responded sincerely, even if a tad facetiously. 3 days later, a cable arrived from the Swedish ambassador to China, transmitting a message from Zhou Enlai. Quote, the Chinese government has decided to release the imprisoned US flyers. Their release from serving the full term takes place in order to maintain friendship with Hammarskjöld, and has no connection to the UN resolution, a resolution the US had pushed through that was pretty tough. Zhou Enlai expresses hope that Hammarskjöld will take note of this point, and Zhou Enlai congratulates Hammarskjöld on his 50th birthday. And it was very deft diplomacy that pulled this off in a way that was a small issue that had huge power to be explosive. One of the other cases I use is the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain and France and Israel had invaded the Suez Canal, and you had 4 crucial issues come together. Egyptian President Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. You had the Arab-Israeli conflict. You had the Third World nationalism, Nasser's Suez Canal nationalization being hailed in the colonial and ex-colonial world as a blow against European imperialism. The Cold War, Nasser having tilted to the Soviet bloc, and the UN's own credibility because 2 permanent members, France and Britain, had been using military force against another member state. This reason this didn't go to further war was largely Hammarskjöld. Hammarskjöld worked the statecraft. Within a few days, he had engineered the very first emergency special session of the General Assembly under a precedent called Uniting for Peace, where the General Assembly can act, still exists when the Security Council doesn't. He got a 64-5 vote on a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all foreign troops, and empowering the Secretary General to take further actions. President Eisenhower was shrewd enough to see how the British-French-Israeli invasion was playing into Soviet opportunism. The last thing we must do, Eisenhower stated at his conference, is disturb any of the delicate negotiations now going on under the leadership of Secretary General Hammarskjöld. We must do nothing that could possibly delay his operations, impede them, or hurt them in any way. Just think about that. An American president saying a Secretary General may have a better chance of resolving this crisis in ways that are our interest as well than I do. We also put sanctions on Britain and France as the US piece, which actually hit Britain particularly pretty hard. And Hammarskjöld basically worked it out. He deployed the first UN peacekeeping force in this role. A lot of credit goes to the Canadian Foreign Minister, UN Ambassador Lester Pearson, who actually got the Nobel for this. Hammarskjöld got one after he was killed, possibly assassinated in 1961. And all of the details, right? So, how would they get the logistical capabilities to get the forces to Egypt? Well, nobody wanted American troops there. That would have blown the deal. But they could have an arm's length arrangement where US airlifts move these UN troops to a staging area outside of Egypt. What about uniforms? Well, the blue helmets, blue berets that we know, basically came about, they didn't have time as manufacturers. They took a bunch of US Army surplus helmets and spray painted them blue. So he was good at that level as well. Now, mind you, at the same time, the Soviet invasion of Hungary was going on, and he was smart enough to know, look, a Secretary General cannot get involved in an issue that's vital to the strategic interests of one of the superpowers. That was just a piece of pragmatism. But basically resolving the Suez Crisis with all 4 of those elements at work was no small deal. He also played a role in decolonization. He gets killed in a plane crash in September 1961 that for a long time was believed to be not an accident, but assassination. Actually, the investigation has been reopened yet again. The variety of possible culprits that are talked about, Belgian mining interests, South Africa, some say the US was involved, but it's an investigation that's going on. So at the end of that section, I make an argument for why we need a Hammarskjöldian Secretary General today. It's not the only issue the UN faces. A recent commission had 10 principles of change along with specific recommendations in 15 issue areas. But no organization can function without a powerful CEO. And I know the political constraints really well. I've run into them in my own political work. They exist in the United States, they exist in the other major powers. The irony or the paradox is that there are many things in the world that we are not able or willing to do, that we want the UN to do as the only alternative, that would serve our interests as well as theirs, yet we're not willing to let the UN have a greater degree of strength or even a degree of assertiveness that would come with this kind of Secretary General. And so we end up sacrificing, because of concerns about encroaching on our prerogative, opportunities for policy benefits that would be in our interest. Part of my goal in making this kind of argument is not to go bet my next mortgage payment that's going to happen, just like the Trump-Kim summit, but to make an argument that really tests the notion of what's realistic. Oh, well, that's not realistic, you know, the Senate would never let it. Well, that's politically true, but what's also unrealistic is to think that some of these issues, Syria is one of them that I was actually quite involved with, can ever get to a better place if there's not a UN role. So to choose which notion of realism you subscribe to, the political or the actual policy. Let me just make a couple comments in conclusion and then turn to you. And I want to read you a passage that, you know, the question is, okay, well, what is, I just realized I never went into, because I got so focused on Aung San Suu Kyi, the two cases in the global sustainability section. One is the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, not for her role as Prime Minister of Norway, but in the 80s she chaired this commission, International Commission on Sustainable Development, that did an enormous amount, both politically between the North and the South of the world, and intellectually to really put together ideologically, conceptually, practically this notion of sustainable development, ways in which concern about the environment and concern about economic development didn't have to be, you know, mutually exclusive, which was a huge issue. We're still working on it 30 years later, but it was her political skills that negotiated and navigated a lot of the differences over that. She then went on to be head of the World Health Organization in the 90s, did dramatic reform there, made it a much more effective organization. It's fallen off since her leadership. But again, really had an important role to play. And I actually wanted to interview her, but it's just hard to work that out. She lives in Norway, and every time she came to the United States, we just couldn't compare schedules. The other chapter is on the Gates Foundation and global public health. Gates Foundation has the second largest budget in the world today for global public health, next to the World Health Organization. And I call that chapter Philanthropy, Statesmanship, and talk about the role that it's played. Again, I bring in some of the critiques of the Gates Foundation, what some people call the Bill chill. You know, if there's an idea out there that Gates doesn't support, it's hard to get funding for it. And I have a colleague, my colleague Kristen Goss, who's a professor at Duke, who's writing this whole book on the pros and cons of philanthropies playing a public role. But I think it's important in the 21st century world to see the way this is emerging. And there are many other examples out there, Doctors Without Borders, a number of other foundations. And so as we think about statesmanship, I really think that that's an important part of the mix. And there too, in that part, you know, again, a lot of application to the 21st century world. So the question is, well, geez, so much has changed. Can we really learn anything from the 20th century here in the 21st century? You know, we got social media, we got this, we got that. So here's just a quick passage. For our everyday life is becoming so saturated with the tremendous power of mass communications. Our political life is becoming so expensive, so mechanized, and so dominated by professional politicians and public relations men that the idealist who dreams of independent statesmanship is really awakened by the necessities of election accomplishment. I'm not going to ask you to guess, but I'll tell you that that was not written the last year or 2 years or 5 years. It was written in 1956 by John Kennedy in President Profiles in Courage. So sure, it's a lot worse today, but this notion of media, money, etc. has been there all along. I talked about the Amnesty International article that launched. We have call it a different species of the same genus, but I really push back at sort of newism that says there's so much different today that there's not lessons to be learned. And I go into some further detail here about lessons for these areas. At the end of the day, the argument is really pretty straightforward. Major peacemaking breakthroughs is difficult, as we see from many of these cases, including the ones that didn't end well. But it's possible, as we see in every case here. My argument is that the breakthroughs mattered irrespective of backlashes. And as we look at the 21st century world, it's really necessary. A lot of the issues we face are just not going to be solved by by incremental progress, and there's some we need fundamental breakthroughs on. So that's the gist of the book. I read a little bit longer than I wanted to, but why don't I stop, and I'd love to take any questions or comments that you folks have. Thank you.
I'm going to let Dr. Jentleson handle the questions himself. I have one about what didn't make it into the book, but I'll let you guys ask your question first. And pick it up later.
Can you elaborate on the human rights portion of your book?
Elaborate on the human rights portion? Yeah. So I go through the story of Amnesty International, which is a particular approach to human rights. It's different than others. And then I go on to say, if we look at the issues, I mean, the Rohingya in Burma, Myanmar is a really good example. There was no government in the world that was, I think they knew, but was willing to raise the issue of the degree of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It was done by two sources. One were investigative journalists, and the other was a human rights group called Human Rights Watch that now has the satellite technology that we used to only associate with governments to produce photographs of villages burned and the like. Human Rights Watch or any other human rights group can't make governments change their policy on the Rohingya or whatever the human rights issues we're concerned about, Venezuela, but they can bring pressure to bear in a variety of ways, directly on governments, bottom up through people, through the media, that will push governments to take actions often, and institutions like the UN take actions often that they'd rather not. And I think that as we think about the 21st century world, and again, this acquisition, if you will, of some capacities we used to associate just with governments, by human rights groups, they're enormously important. We should, and I say that this is not to sort of slough off, say, oh, the State Department doesn't have to worry about human rights. You know, the human rights groups will take care of it. But it's the role that they have, you know, in that action. And there's been a proliferation of groups, including many, by the way, that are indigenous to countries. There's a little bit of backlash, not backlash, but a serious disagreement over Western groups that have a particular conception of human rights in some societies. Some people see as a version, including people that are not just, you know, bad guy dictators, but, you know, have different views of the culture in their society. And it's been important for indigenous groups to grow up, which have legitimacy and credibility in their own society. So I think we'll continue to see a lot of that. And there's disagreements among them on how to do this. I mean, I'll give you one other example. On a lot of major, so for example, during the Bosnia conflict, when I was in the State Department in 93, 94, we would convene meetings with human rights groups and humanitarian aid groups. And humanitarian aid groups would often argue for getting that aid to the people, even if it helps support the government that's the violator, because we needed to help the people. And a lot of the human rights groups would argue, no, that will just keep that violator in power. Interesting debate. So it wasn't just people that cared about people and not. So they really play an increasingly important role. Yes, sir.
Do you have any thoughts about, well, you talk about peacemakers. Do you have any thoughts about the thinning out of the State Department under the current administration? And not just what it means diplomatically, but what it means as an overall strategy, especially bulking up the military, thinning that out, not taking a peacemaking view of the world.
Yeah, it's really awful, and it's a trend that precedes this administration. That's complicated. And in 2016, I was chairing one of the Hillary Clinton foreign policy groups. We're working with a lot of people in the State Department, including younger people, and some of them were just really disillusioned. Right? They said, "Look, you know, we know we have to work with presidents we don't agree with, but this has gone too far," and they've left. There's a human capital problem, and so for all of you people, when I get out of college, if you're interested in international affairs, your options are basically go to grad school, get a PhD, go join the Peace Corps, or join the Foreign Service, right? This is the early mid-70s. Today, I didn't do any of them. I went to Europe with friends, we bought a van, we traveled for a year at $6 a day, and then we got serious of life. We had a great time. My parents weren't real happy then. But today, all of you have a huge number of choices. Again, leaving politics aside, you can go work for this NGO community where it's not a salary issue, but sometimes my students say, well, I feel like I can have more impact. You can go work for the private sector that has a very important role. You can do a lot of it. So we are competing in the Foreign Service for the human capital we need to be effective in all aspects of our diplomacy. The current administration sets that back enormously. Colin Powell actually took this fairly seriously when he was Secretary of State, and it got drowned out by the Iraq War because he could see it with the military. I will also say that, by the way, that I work with we have a lot of military fellows that doing degrees and coming for a year of study. And I just want to caution anybody that associates military people with more likely to use force. It's not always that way, but it doesn't mean they can do what the State Department does. I think it's accurate, but it's often said that the Foreign Service budget is less than the budget for the military bands. So it's a huge problem, and it's deeper than just current policies.
To follow up on that, you've mentioned global warming and issues of sustainability. Wouldn't that indicate a greater need for peacemaking as opposed to military readiness, at least in some aspects?
To a certain extent, I mean, we had these, forever wars, and everything, and I think that's right. It's not to me so much zero sum. I mean, if I'm in Congress, I got to figure out how to spend the money I have available. So I think they're all important, and so we had increased statesmanship roles for the Environmental Protection Agency and for Department of Health and Human Services, and CDC here was hugely involved in the Ebola and others. So I think this broader conception of statesmanship goes to a lot of elements of it. I'm hopeful that we're seeing some change. The polls are showing some change in climate change. Is it like today, not just down the road? As Professor Rubin said, I worked for Al Gore way back when he was getting involved in these issues. And I had worked this issue for him, but I was around him, and that was over 30 years ago when he was dismissed as Senator Ozone. So I think it's extreme. I mean, in the book I say that the reason I chose those two issues is we do a lot on WMD, weapons of mass destruction, and rightly so. But climate change is EMD, environmental mass destruction. And pandemics are DMD, disease mass destruction. The models out of CDC and elsewhere, what we could get from a pandemic, are not up there with nuclear weapons, but they're up there with chemical, biological. These are very serious security issues, not just humanity issues. So. Way in the back.
Sorry. Yeah. Before you ask a question, please wait for the microphone. Okay. Thank you.
So this is a little bit like on another side, but you mentioned that there were some chapters that you couldn't include in the book. If there was another chapter that you could have included, or out of the ones that you couldn't include, which one would it be, and could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, there were three that I had going. One was on Václav Havel, because the way he led the end of Soviet domination in this country was so different than Valence's, and there were really interesting lessons in both, right? And they said do one or the other, and I thought Valence worked better for the book. So that was one that was close to done. Second was Anwar Sadat. I wanted to pair Sadat and Rabin. And again, when I say Rabin, I mean other people come into play. Bill Clinton does, Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres, but they're my statesmanship when they call. And the third was the founders of the European Union. And I was going to do a joint chapter on Jean Monnet, Schuman, and Adenauer, French and German. Because we forget, amidst all the others of the EU, that after 2 world wars in Europe in the 20th century, the founding of the EU has, we had the Yugoslav War, but has prevented that from happening again, and that's not small change. And I wanted to be able to make that point, and then go on and talk a little bit about why the EU is run into problems. So those were the three. I was in the UK for a week giving talks in October, and no surprise, I got a lot about what about Churchill, right? And my reasoning was that while it's true that you can't make peace unless you win the war, and his role in that was enormous, but when it came to post-war peacemaking, I mean, he was totally committed to holding on to the empire. His language about Gandhi, etc. And he actually gets voted out of office the next year. So, I didn't include him for that reason. And I think people accept, again, they accept that explanation. They say, well, I would have included him. That's fine. So those were the main ones. Any come to mind for you that you're wondering about? Okay. Just follow where the microphone goes.
So obviously the North Korean issue is very complicated. So you mentioned you hope that there would be a breakthrough with the talks. I guess it would be next week from now. What are some potential examples of policy proposals that you might have for Trump's team, and what politically could you see as being helpful or harmful for the negotiations going forward? Because I'm just assuming that neither leader is making decisions in a vacuum, and I'm assuming that Kim Jong-un has hardliners in his government just like Donald Trump does.
Yeah. So on your last point, which is the managing the politics, we don't totally know, or we probably know less about North Korea than any other country, but the general sense is that he has enough political control to deliver, right? On the terms of a deal, the crucial issue to me, and many of my colleagues, especially Ruben and others, are much more expert on nuclear issues than I am, but you have to have a plan or a roadmap for what you mean by denuclearization, and what the relationship is between what they do and what they get. So we often say, well, they've made deals in the past and they've reneged on them, so you give everything to them at the end. The deal in 1994, which was I wasn't involved, but I was in the State Department, and my colleague Bob Gallucci was the main negotiator. The full story is that they made some moves, and we did not deliver because the Senate would not approve some of the things that Clinton negotiators did. So if you're North Korean, and doesn't mean that they would have delivered anyway, but if you're North Korean, there's a legitimate argument there about waiting. So you have to have some. One of the things that concerns me the most is my example of what Kissinger and Zhou Enlai did, all those talk. There's very sporadic staff work going on. Steve Biegun, who's been named as the main special envoy, he's had 1 or 2 meetings. These are complicated issues that the techie people say would take at minimum 10 to 15 years to do complete verify, what is it, CVIV or something? Is that? Yeah. Am I on the right track, Rachel?
Yes, you're
Okay, good. You really need to do this. And my worry, and I say this in the article, is the first summit was, hey, they met. Now President Obama did say to President-elect Trump the number one issue that he was worried about was North Korea. But the escalation of that issue over that year and a half through Rocket Man, all this stuff, if we were on the verge of war, they had gotten us there, both of them, right, the back and forth. This time, I think expectations are different. North Koreans have played their cards rather shrewdly. Xi Jinping had refused to meet for many years with Kim. They've now had 3 summits. The last one last month, January, was a big deal. The South Korean president and Kim have had 4 summits. So he has come out looking like, the reasonable guy, whether he is or not. And the South Koreans are trying to move ahead with certain issues. And I really worry that, and then I'll get into Trump's personal style. If Kim doesn't do what he wants him to do, I worry deeply about returning to Rocket Man and all sorts of things, particularly combined with the political problems Donald Trump's facing these days since the midterms, the Mueller stuff, et cetera, the government shutdown. And so the part of the argument I make is this may be a situation where, unless you really try to make the summit successful, and I don't mean even anything comparable to the 1972 Shanghai Communique, but something closer to that. If that doesn't happen, we might have been better off with no summit rather than this summit. Because I don't think you can get credit. I think I use a line in there, you can't just say, we came, we talked, we went home, and we called it a great thing. I don't think that'll work as much this time. And it may work in the moment, but what happens next? So that's my worry. I think I'm being analytic. I can't say I'm not partisan at all, but I think I'm being analytic. So, yeah.
Going back to your discussion of non-government organizations, what do you think the UN's role should be in fostering them, or should it let them try to develop on their own?
Great question. A lot of the USAID, the Agency for International Development budget, actually gets funneled through NGOs. And it's been going on for 25, 30 years now with the trend line in that direction, partly because there's a sense that they have an expertise that we don't always have internally. Kind of what I said, where a lot of really capable people are going to NGOs. And sometimes it's better to have a project that doesn't have the flag on it, right? Even though the money might come from there. The money comes from fundraising and foundations and philanthropies as well. So it's important that we support them and that we listen to them. Like the meeting I described in the State Department, where we want to hear their points of view, that they're included just as much as a political interest group or business or labor or whatever. At the same time, sometimes we start to think NGOs are the good guys. I have my students read a couple of articles that talk about NGOs have their own organizational imperatives. They need to raise funds and they compete with each other. And sometimes they go for projects that will get them funding even if they're not the best choice for the ultimate goals, say, of sustainable development or human rights. So we shouldn't get to the point where they're always the good guys, but they have an enormous role to play. And often they have ongoing relationships with the communities and other organizations they work with. And so some of their funding has to come from one of my former students who's working for undergraduates, who's working in Washington now. We just had coffee the other day, and she's working for an NGO that's doing a bunch of projects actually in West Africa, and now she's off to Lebanon. And their money is coming from USAID through this NGO, and then she goes off and does them. So very important in this mixed kind of relationship.
Why would Kissinger write a book entitled Ending the Vietnam War when he knew that the war did not end when he negotiated our departure?
And I think he also knew that it could have been ended sooner, which has come out 67, 68 in the negotiation the Johnson administration was party to, that he had access to, that he leaked to Nixon to get in a little favored position. As I said before, I don't think I've ever written anything positive about Kissinger in Vietnam. There was a former CIA agent named Frank Snapp who wrote a book called Decent Interval. And that was what they're trying to do. Say, look, they're going to fall, but let's claim a decent interval here that we're gone, and it's not like, Somalia, Black Hawk Down, right in the immediate thing. And it wasn't such a decent interval as I think we know, and I suspect you may know even more than I do. So it was, Kissinger was manipulative, he was political, he was an egotist, he didn't think small countries mattered, it was all about the chessboard, and all of those things went into Chile, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc. I do nevertheless look at the China one as one in which I think he achieved something that we can learn from, and I'm willing to give him credit for it, even if the question was what's your net assessment of Henry Kissinger wouldn't outweigh the oral negative.
I have a question regarding treaties and the role of the Senate. So I know that you talked about specifically with Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations and how that was shot down. I was wondering if you could just speak to the point about how recently it seems like so many of the deals that are agreed to aren't actually they don't actually make it to the treaty stage, so they're not formally ratified by the Senate. And then also sort of on that same note, I guess, the authorization of the use of military force and how these sorts of issues are often talked about in Congress, but no one actually, votes on them or, actually has to make a decision.
Great questions. So I'll do a little plug before I answer the questions. If you really want to know how the Congress operates, and if you're an MSNBC watcher and you stay up for Lawrence O'Donnell at 10 o'clock at night, you'll see a younger guy than me with the same last name, the first name Adam, who's on all the time. My son, he was the deputy chief of staff for Senator Harry Reid when Harry Reid was majority minority leader. In fact, he was just on the other night, and I missed him because I was watching Duke basketball, so he was on that, but I usually watch. So I actually learned a lot about the workings of the Senate, from chatting with him. And it's a useful non-Facebook way of staying in touch. I've been getting emails from people I went to high school and college with who I haven't heard from, see them on TV, and they look me up and they say, oh, hey, you know. So anyway, so on the authorization of use of force, you know, this has been fundamentally, neither side really wants to deal with it. In 2001, after 9/11, I don't think there's any doubt that President Bush could have gotten a declaration of war against Afghanistan from the Congress. Presidents sometimes say, well, you know, a declaration of war constrains me more than just saying I don't really need congressional approval. And Congress didn't demand a declaration of war. And there have been a number of efforts. There was one in the Obama administration, Senator Tim Kaine was pushing this for a long time, senator from Virginia, to get, you know, action on the AU, end it, you know, now, and if you want another one, either a declaration of war or another AUMF. And it's been one where basically all sides like hide under the table. And it's not good for the country. You know, probably the most profound decision we make is for putting our, you know, men and women at risk in war, and things we don't call war, but are really wars. It's been a little bit, well, it hasn't blown up like Vietnam, so I guess it's okay. And that's not okay, either from basic democracy or when it blows up, it's too late. So, you know, I'm not optimistic. You know, I think that we may be seeing a withdrawal from Afghanistan. By the way, people that are interested in that issue, there's a really interesting article also on War in the Rocks yesterday, the day before, by General Dave Barno, who was the commander of American troops, and Nora Ben Sahel, who's PhD, worked for RAND and elsewhere, what they call the 5 myths emerging from Afghanistan that we need to be conscious of as myths as we do the debate. Really, really thoughtful piece. On your other question on treaties, I mean, you're right. And this is the part that we have to understand. It's not just a current thing in the Trump administration. In the 90s, in the Clinton-Gore administration, we went to Rome and we agreed to the International Criminal Court Treaty, but we never put it before the Senate because basically they were told we'll never get it ratified. Okay? You may think that's a good thing. People may not think that treaty was a good thing, but then maybe we shouldn't have signed it. The Kyoto Accord, 1997. It's interesting. In 1994, the trade agreement that created the World Trade Organization from what was called the GATT before that was signed, and both sides made a deal to put it in the Senate after the midterm election. Robert Dole was the Senate leader, and Clinton, because he said, then you can get the votes to pass it. Everybody knows it's a good idea, but they're afraid to vote for it. And so they did this little, when you had that degree of bipartisanship, we were able to kind of, but we shouldn't have to do that as well. And so I think there's become a sense that treaties are bad. You know, they hurt the United States more than, or they don't work. You know, the landmine treaty, which was actually a question of NGOs. NGOs were the principal mover behind that to get governments to do it. We haven't signed it. You know, we have an issue with Korea that's manageable within the treaty. So part of the reason I do the 2 cheers, not 3 cheers, is because I think we've got to give diplomacy a better name, but also I think it's somehow this notion that we can go it alone, and I think that's very dangerous, especially in a 21st century world. So
we have time for one last grand question, possibly.
the man with the microphone has to.
The microphone's going to take a vote. Here we go.
Hi. As someone who is beginning to take international affairs classes and is better understanding the relationship between states and other organizations, what would you recommend someone like me to do to become more aware of global and economic affairs? Are there any books, obviously your book, but but any other books that you would recommend for someone like me to read?
First of all, I tell you to take as many classes as you can with this amazing faculty you have. They really are great. I mean, they really are great people and doing really interesting work as scholars and policy and teachers. It's really hard. I mean, I think I'd try to get yourself into a diet of reading some kinds of publications on a regular basis. I do believe the New York Times is still the best newspaper for international news. In the on-site world, you probably want to be reading like foreignpolicy.com, foreignaffairs.com, warontherocks.com. They do less on economics. I'm trying to think of what would be good on trade and other issues. I don't really. The Economist, I guess, but they often has a paywall. Maybe you can get through the Georgia Tech Library. Actually, another really interesting one is called Lawfare, that was started by some law folks in the national security area. I've written for it, and they do really interesting work on some of the national security issues, civil liberties and stuff. It's worth reading as well. I wish I could think. I mean, the Financial Times is the best, and you can usually get that from a library without worrying about a paywall. So I'd start with those. It's really hard to point to a single book that really gets it, and I can't think of one that I would say. I would say read by scholars. I would sort of stay away from, for the most part, memoirs by policy people, because they really usually tell you what they want you to know. Sometimes they'll write serious books. I would also read some work by some really interesting international journalists who are out there in the field, writing really interesting things. So anyway, that's a start on hopefully useful advice. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I don't have a microphone, so I'll yell. I want to give a great big thank you both to your questions and of course to Dr. Jentleson.
Thank you.